Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Kevin Whitt. He's a metabolic health educator. Today's Kevin MD article is Insulin Resistance is Not a Disease, it's a Metabolic Reframe. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Much
All right.
appreciated being here. Always
All right.
good to share information with those who are interested.
All right. So tell us briefly a little bit about yourself and what you do.
I was born in Ohio, so I'm a Buckeye back in Ohio. And over the years, I've become very interested in my own personal health. And as I began to learn what I was not able to learn from the mainstream medical community, I began to understand that there were many things that were being left out of the information packet that the average Joe is being told in America. And so I have made it a point to take information to people that they are not getting on a regular basis or at all from the medical community that I believe is extremely important that they know.
All right. And today we're going to talk about insulin resistance, of course. And for those who didn't get a chance to read your article, just tell us what it's about.
Insulin resistance is one of those phrases that is bandied about on a regular basis, and it conceals what is really going on at the physiological level in the human body. And so it's a two-word phrase that, in my opinion, is quite confusing and misleading to the patients who are dealing with either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. And therefore, I think it's extremely important that that be cleared up.
All right. So tell us some of the confusion that led you to reframing insulin resistance.
Well, there is a there is a science called the Randle cycle that's been around for 63 years and was developed by a man named Randle. He and his team discovered this Randle cycle in 1963. It is not something that you hear anything about, and it is something that is not taught to any aspect of the medical community, whether it's doctors, nurses, etc. And therefore, it never gets shared with mainstream America. And of course, when you have 35 million type 2 diabetics, this is something they need to understand because type 2 diabetes is an epidemic in the United States, and it is quickly becoming a pandemic because this, what we call the SAD diet, standard American diet, is now spreading all around the world. And it's devastating to people. And here's another very important aspect of it. When people are told they have a disease, then the red flags go up, the alarm bells go up, and they're told that this disease they have is progressive and chronic. Type 2 diabetes simply is not progressive and it is not chronic. Type 2 diabetes is easy to prevent, and type 2 diabetes can be reversed. It's a simple matter of knowledge. And one of the things I equate that to is back in 1965, cigarette smoking was becoming a problem. And what did we do? We put a warning label on cigarette packages. And people then, once they had the information, they took the bull by the horns and they slowly but surely stopped smoking cigarettes. And we're down to about 14% of all adults in the United States smoking today. We can do the same thing with type 2 diabetes. The proper information has to be given to people, and they can't be convinced that they have a disease that they're going to have to live with, and there's nothing they can do about it except be treated for it for the rest of their lives, because it just takes away the hope of a normal life. And it's important that people have the right information, and then they can take that information and use it or not use it. That becomes up to them. But preventing and reversing type 2 diabetes is totally up to the individual as long as they have the information to do it.
So you mentioned about the Randle cycle. For those who aren't familiar with that, what is it and how does it relate to the prevention of diabetes?
Well, I'll explain the Randle cycle this way. First, I will use a vegan as an example, and then I'll use a carnivore as an example, because those are both ends of the spectrum, and then there are all those that fall in between that spectrum. So on any given cell, you have two receptors. One is called the GLUT4, G-L-U-T, 4, number 4 receptor, and that is where sugar enters into the cell. You have a second receptor. It's called the CD36 receptor, and that is where fat and fat only comes into the cell. So when sugar is flowing freely into the cell and finally makes its way across the membrane and into that part of the cell where the mitochondria are, then the mitochondria are using sugar only to produce ATP for the purposes of energy, because that vegan is eating fruits and vegetables, and all fruits and vegetables, all fruits are already sugar. There's no transition time, 50% fructose, 50% glucose. And then on the, and oh, and I'm sorry, the 50% fructose is the other part of that. And then all vegetables, upon being put to digestion in the human body, all convert to glucose. So the vegan is feeding the body totally sugar. So once that sugar gets down into the mitochondria turn that into ATP on the way to becoming energy for the body. So at that point, because of the Randle cycle, a signal is sent over to the fat pathway and shuts it down so quickly over to the CD36. That fat pours into the cell and it goes down, and it's coming in on a protein-based transformer. And once it gets down to the membrane that separates the main part of the cell from the mitochondria, it jumps on board a transporter, and that's what the CD36 is, also a transporter. That transporter carries that fat over into the area where the mitochondria are. So the mitochondria then are using fat to make the ATP for energy purposes. So now we've jumped over from the vegan over to the other extreme, which is the carnivore. Now, once sugar is being used by the mitochondria, a signal is sent over to shut down, as I said before, shut down the ability of fat to move into the mitochondrial area of the cell. The same thing, though, happens when fat is the main thing that's being fed to the cell. It sends a signal up to the GLUT4 entry for sugar and shuts it down, because the cell, if it's using all sugar, it likes to continue using all sugar. If it's using all fat, it likes to continue using all fat. But here's the main point as it relates to type 2 diabetes. When fat is being used and the signal is sent from the mitochondria up to the GLUT4 entry point for sugar, it works like a rheostat. It can leave that door open, it can close it slightly, or it can close it off. And it is a natural physiological function that allows that sugar flow to be stopped. And that is what is called insulin resistance. But there is no insulin resistance going on, because insulin resistance makes it sound as though the body's having a problem. It's not having a problem. It is simply doing what it has learned to do over the eons of us becoming human beings. So that sugar flow is shut down intentionally, because too much sugar in the cell becomes poisonous or toxic to the cell. Fat can come in to the cell and it can hang out in the cell, and it's not toxic in the bloodstream, it's not toxic in the cell. Sugar, however, in the form of glucose in this particular case, is toxic to the blood. which is why our body makes such an effort to remove it from the blood. It's also toxic at high levels in the cell. So this notion of insulin resistance is a non-starter. And if a person understands the Randle cycle, then they understand that that GLUT4 door is being slammed shut, and it doesn't make any difference, Dr. Kevin, how much insulin is thrown at that GLUT4 pathway. That door simply will not open. And that's because of the physiological response, the signaling that's coming from the mitochondrial area of the cell. It has nothing to do with the cell ignoring the insulin. And so, therefore, people have to understand that their body is only doing what it has learned to do over the eons as we develop as more efficient and higher form human beings.
Now, if patients know this information, the Randle cycle that you just described, what kind of changes can they make to hopefully prevent the onset of any diabetes?
Well, I have what is called the 14-word solution, and it sums everything up very nicely. And that 14-word solution is simply this. Over the next 6 weeks, slowly but surely, remove all carbohydrate from your diet. What happens then is you are decreasing the sugar load. Therefore, you're decreasing the amount of insulin because obviously as blood sugar increases, insulin increases. And if you are constantly eating sugar all day long, over and over and over again, several times, which is what we do in the United States, the vast majority of people, they're eating that SAD diet, standard American diet. They're eating a load of carbs and they're doing it multiple times per day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And the next thing you know, the doctor gives you a call and says, "Oh, got your blood work back. You are a type 2 diabetic." What folks have to understand is that there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate for the human body. So my body lives on protein and fat. The vegan lives on sugar, 100% sugar. However, there's then that middle area, which is the SAD diet, standard American diet, where people are eating a combination of protein, fat, carbohydrates. And this is very important also. When a person is eating that mixed diet, then you create a conflict at the cellular level because of the Randle cycle, which is constantly being activated over and over and over again. And the key element to remember is when this Randle cycle is being activated, then inflammation is being created in abundance in every single cell of the body. And that inflammation is the very thing that is causing, or let me rephrase, is part of all of these major diseases that we get through the course of our lives. And the other thing that's important to remember is, just like, for instance, cancer, the best way to deal with cancer is to prevent cancer. Mm-hmm. And the way you prevent cancer and heart disease, strokes, kidney disease, et cetera, is to not allow yourself to become a type 2 diabetic. And so, back to the Randle cycle for a second, when vegans are feeding only sugar, the Randle cycle has very little reason to activate because it's getting a sugar flow on a regular basis, and there is no conflict going on in the cell. It's the same thing with the carnivore. They're feeding the cell fat. The cells are living off of fat, and there's very little Randle cycle activation. It's when you eat that mixed diet that the Randle cycle is activated. And how do we know that that's happening here in the United States? Well, as I've already mentioned, there's 35 million people who are type 2 diabetics. And we also know that 90% of the American population is either metabolically challenged, which is a nice way of saying you're well on your way to becoming a type 2 diabetic, or you're already a type 2 diabetic. And so it is an epidemic. And what we must do is inform the people now on as large a scale as possible, because, like the old saying, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because over the next 5-10 years, we're not going to have 35 million type 2 diabetics. We're going to have 50 million type 2 diabetics. And it's a huge profit center, which unfortunately has to be taken into the equation. So if you convince people they have a disease, even though they don't have a disease, and we can clearly explain to people that it's not a disease, which leaves them in total control, then they end up believing and being treated for the rest of their life by being told, like our neighbor, who is a type 2 diabetic, to eat 55 grams of carbohydrate with every meal and then turn around and take the insulin to offset the carbohydrate you've just eaten. It's a foolish effort at dealing with the type 2 diabetes. However, it makes no attempt to prevent it or to reverse it. It simply tells the patient, you are going to be, and we're here for you to treat this for you for the
Right.
next 10, 15, 20 years, as long as you live.
Okay. So I'm a primary care physician. What are some of the things that I can tell my patients short of stop taking all carbohydrates? What are some realistic things that we can get patients to accept in the exam room?
Well, the way I approach that is simply this. On the one hand, you can tell the patient that if they want to allow themselves to be as healthy as their DNA will allow them to be, then you take the time, the 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, to slowly but surely remove those carbohydrates and get rid of all of them because they are not essential. Or you can tell the patient, you can continue on as the average American does, eating 275 grams of carbohydrate a day and become either continue being a type 2 diabetic or become a type 2 diabetic. Or you can choose something in between. So if you drop from 275 grams of carb a day down to 200, are you going to be better off? Yes, but marginally. What if you drop that carb intake to 150 grams? Well, you're going to be a little better off. But are you going to reverse the type 2 diabetes? No. So if you want to reverse the type 2 diabetes, you have to remove the vast majority of those carbohydrates. Now, like I said, you can max out your health by removing all carbohydrates, and it's very doable. It is not difficult at all. I eat 0 carbohydrates, and I get along just fine. It was easy for me to make that transition once I began learning all of this. So the patient then has to decide for themselves where they're going to take that carbohydrate into, what level they're going to take that carbohydrate to. 100 grams, 50 grams, 20 grams. Now, if they really want to give themselves a chance to become as healthy as they can be, they've got to get that carb, depending on who you're talking to, got to get that carb intake down to, at the very least, less than 100 grams of carb a day. 50 is better, 20 is great. I eat about 6 grams of carb a day. And the reason is because you cannot go 0 carb.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why is because there's carb even in small amounts of carb in meat, in eggs, that type of thing. So if I could go 0 carb, I wouldn't. But I'm at 2, 4, 6 grams of carb per day, and that's my daily routine. And another thing that makes it that easy for me is the fact that I eat only 1 meal a day.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm considered an OMAD carnivore. And that 1 meal a day, I eat high quality food every night for dinner. However, that doesn't mean expensive food. It means primarily beef and eggs, some dairy if you can deal with it. And there are many, many types of meat that you can eat. Beef just happens to be the one we have in our society today that gives us the most nutrition from a meal. So it becomes the patient's decision.
Sure.
Do you want to get away from needing any insulin at all? Drop those carbs. And if you want to go to zero, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, or close to zero, sorry. Or you can get it down to 20. It depends on the patient, but they have to have the information so they can make the decision, understanding that they're not locked into a situation where they are being medicated for the rest of their lives when it is unnecessary.
Do you ever get hungry eating one meal a day?
No, I do not. And the reason is because the food I eat for my dinner is high quality food, not expensive food, high quality food. And therefore, my body reaches satiation relatively quickly. And I just simply don't get hungry during the next day. Now, for instance, when we get done here, Marcia and I'll be heading to the gym, and we do 2 intense workouts a week. I call them HIST, high intensity strength training. Minimum time, maximum effort gives you maximum result.
Mm-hmm.
I never carb load in any way,
Yeah.
shape, or form before going into exercise. But the vast majority of people who go into a gym believe that they have to carb load in order to get through those workouts. Even distance runners, long distance runners, are finally realizing that they do not need to carb load for several days before going out and running a marathon. Because when my body needs glucose, which it does occasionally for red blood cells, muscle cells, brain cells, then even though I eat no carbohydrate, I eat no glucose. Well, where does my body get that glucose from? Well, obviously, it makes it for itself. It's called gluconeogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
You, of course, know that, and most of your listeners may know that. So when I need the glucose, my body makes it. How much does it make? Exactly what I need. When does it make it? When I need it.
We're talking to Kevin Whitt, metabolic health educator. Today's Kevin MD article is Insulin Resistance is Not a Disease, a Metabolic Reframe. Kevin, let's end with briefly sharing your take-home messages to the Kevin MD audience.
The take-home message is that the individual in the United States must understand that insulin resistance is a fabrication. It really doesn't exist. And we know that because of the Randle cycle effect on the body. And if you want to maximize your health, then you must begin slowly but surely reducing the carb intake from your body. And instead of 7 times a day eating, including snacks and all that, reduce it down to 1 or 2 meals per day, remembering that it's the inflammation that is causing all of the diseases. And once a person becomes a type 2 diabetic, they open that door for cancer, heart disease, et cetera, all those diseases that we deal with on a regular basis in the United States. So, got to reduce the carbs, and you must do it slowly over the 6 to 8 weeks, because you must give the microbiome a chance to adjust to the fact that so many of those microbes are living on something that you should not be eating. And as you reduce those carbs, there's going to be a little bit of a war going on, because those microbes, bacteria, they want to live just as much as a human does or as much as an animal does. And so you must give the gut microbiome a chance to adjust to your dietary changes.
Kevin, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.
I thank you very much. And I hope today finds you and yours very well.